Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in. I'm sort of trying to figure out how to look at everybody without, yeah, right, got that worked out. Yeah, just to get things started, I just thought, I'd laid down the rules, which means, could you just check that your mobile phones are off? Um, uh, Sorry, the flies. Um, I just thought I'd just give you a brief overview of how we're going to sort of conduct this, just so you know that there's 10 minutes of questions at the end. So it might be something that you might want to think about as we go along. I'll be asking some general questions about the craft and the short story to both Roanna and Alice, which will then be followed by specific questions to both of them. I've really enjoyed reading their books, and not once, twice. That's particularly, it's been good fun. Yeah, so with that, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of Mabantua, the Aranda people on whose lands we meet today and on whose lands I've lived and worked on for 8 years. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and future. Now, I've had the good fortune, I'm sorry, maybe I should introduce myself as well. I'm not that well known. My name is Yash Srivastava, and I've lived in Alice Springs for about 8 years. It's nice to see a few of my friends here. Anyway, now I've also had the good fortune of and the privilege of working and interacting with traditional owners and indigenous custodians of the land in 4 states, stretching across, all the way from Western Australia through to Queensland and South and so on. And the diversity of languages and cultures has been absolutely fascinating. It's also brought into sharp focus aspects of our shared humanity. So while we've talked intensively over the last few days about difference and diversity, I think it's time to also sort of take cognizance of the fact that there is a shared humanity as much as anything we share. And some of it has got to do with the land that we all live on and work on, and I think that comes up through several things. And I have to say that both these writers, in some ways, have reminded me of that. And so I just thought, I'd mention Roanna's it's a little quote, and I don't remember the exact words, so just correct me if I've got it wrong. Where I think you said all writing is an act of exploration of identity, and I think that, and Alice, some of your writing again sort of constantly reminds me of that fact, of what we all share as human beings in some ways. And for me, a lot of this is not about what we are, which I think is a relational concept about people, how we sort of position ourselves relative to externalities, but a little more about who we are, which is an aspect of versus the subjective being, which is a little more absolute, but also an elusive concept, which we may never find. So I'm sort of again, reminded of there's an old Indian parable, and while Roanna's on the stage with me, there's a musk deer in India which has these sort of scent glands, and the parable goes around chasing it without realizing that the scent gland is within itself. So in the latter half of its life, it discovers that it's all within. And I think that's something that both these books have reminded me of. So now, although both of you have written short stories and you both write extremely beautifully, and and you both led very distinctive lives, I find that a lot of this stuff that we're talking about here has that convergence. Now, for Alice, the trauma of the fires of Black Saturday are very much what informs a lot of the characters and how they sort of developed and built up is around these events and of the fires of Black Saturday. While in your case, Roanna, quite often it's about migration and the loss of the familiar, and I think both of you seem to talk about that a lot in your books. And it becomes a very central motif for the onward journey, and which sort of brings us to aspects of that. So the loss of the familiar holds in its fold the promise of the new, of regeneration, of the impossibility of returning to an unrecoverable past, and brings one, I think, a step closer to the realization of who we are. So with that, I'd just like to introduce the two authors. I'm sorry for that long prelude, but
that was great.
it was important.
Important.
So Alice Bishop grew up in Christmas Hills, Victoria. Her writing has been published by Mianjin, Overland, Australian Book Review, Lip Magazine, and the Wheeler Centre. Her debut book is a short story collection called The Constant Hum. That beautiful cover there with those beautiful native plants. I just want to remind all of you that this book has had a special run from text, and it'll be launched by Tony Birch in July.
Yeah.
So that should be very exciting. So you have this opportunity to get these books before anybody else. So I'd strongly recommend that you go and get hold of it and get your autographs on it while you can. Now moving on to Roanna. Roanna Gonsalves is the author of The Permanent Resident, which is the University of Western Australia publication, which won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, Multicultural Prize in 2018, and was long listed for the Dobby Award. Her writing has been compared to the work of Alice Munro and Jhumpa Lahiri. Her 4-part radio documentary series, On the Tip of a Billion Tongues, which is an ABC Radio National Year short production, is a portrayal of of contemporary India through its multilingual writers. Roanna is a recipient of the Prime Minister's Australia Asia Endeavour Award, and there's more information on Roanna's website, which is roannagonsalves.com.au. And we heard a little bit about that yesterday while Kate was facilitating that session with 4 writers. With that, I just thought we might just move on to talking about the form, the genre, which is short fiction. So the Booker-nominated writer Sarah Hall has said that the short story structure can be demanding. So I'll start with you, Roanna. Does writing a short story pose any specific constraints or freedoms for you? And if so, can you explain?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Yash, for that absolutely generous and very erudite introduction. Is the mic on?
No. I don't.
Okay. Oh, yeah, now we're on. First of all, Yash, thank you so much for that very generous and erudite introduction. It's such a privilege to have someone like you facilitate this panel and introduce us and be in conversation with us. So thank you for all the work you've put in. The short story form, and I just want to say about identity, I said like all identity is an exploration of, no, what did I say? All writing is an exploration of identity. And I said that in the context of usually non-white writers get asked to talk about identity. White writers get asked to talk about the craft and the imagination. So I was saying, actually, all writing is an exploration of identity. It's just that white identity is masked as neutral. And so when white writers talk about surfing, that's seen as like neutral. Of course, all Australians surf, like, ha. But actually, that's a very particular exploration of identity as well. And that's great, except that we need to recognize that all writing is about identity in some way or the other. The short story form, I think it's liberating in many ways, in that it allows for the possibility of actually the labor of writing, containing it in a short period of time, I suppose. I thought, if I write short stories, I can do it quicker than a novel, but actually, of course, it took 18 years to get this book out. I think the constraints are that, it's a heightened use of language and heightened use of experience and that you need to contain within a short span of time. Uh, but you can play with time in interesting ways, with chronology and duration in interesting ways in the short story form. I think for me, the short story form affords the possibilities of capturing those fleeting moments and capturing multiplicity. Of course, you can capture multiplicity in a novel like Salman Rushdie can, but I'm not Salman Rushdie, so I thought the short story form allowed me to capture the multiplicity of the stories I was trying to chronicle. Yeah, different voices, different aspects of the experience of being an outsider. So I think this book is about being an outsider, and it allowed me to look at different ways of being an outsider and how that might be rendered on the page economically.
And how well you've done it. That's, what about you, Alice? What is the short story sort of genre? Is it?
So I kind of always talk about my writing practice in that I'm also a big reader and I love reading short stories. And I think in some of the more unstable parts of my life, I've turned to write, like I've come across writers. I don't know if anyone's aware of Josephine Rowe. She's written a beautiful collection called Tar Cut Awake. And short stories have really kind of kept me going when it's been hard. And I think that's kind of something writing A Constant Hum was also interesting because there are quite some very, very short stories in there. So some that are like 8 words long. And for me, it's really kind of what Roanna was saying, that kind of just like capturing that heightened feeling of something that's so big and beyond you. But if you can kind of put it into a story, there's some kind of comfort in that in a way. I think. I think I think there's always that kind of idea that, when I got my book deal, they were like, oh, what's your novel going to be? And I just, the idea of writing a novel is dreadful for me because I love short stories so much, and I love novels and I love nonfiction, and I just love short stories. I love short stories so much.
Yeah.
I loved reading Ryan's work, and I'm really excited to come away from this beautiful festival with my suitcases full of books. But short stories. I think also with our kind of, I work in an office full time, and if you can kind of go on your lunch break and kind of learn something from a short story without that kind of commitment to a novel, it's really good to kind of duck in and duck out, I guess. Yeah.
No, it's been absolutely wonderful reading your stories, your short stories, and yet I find that there's, although each of the stories is different, there's something that sort of holds them all together so beautifully. And it's, for me, I'm just a reader. I'm not a writer, so I don't totally understand what goes behind it. I know it's a lot of work, but that's absolutely fantastic. So now just coming to the theme of the session, which is regeneration. I'll just very quickly read something that I read while I read, and I said Alice's regeneration is slow. It's about a reclaiming of familiar or an intimate memory, and is inextricably tied to a lost and an ancient landscape. Roanna's is the urgent formation of relationships with the new and unfamiliar. A desire to rapidly put roots down into a new landscape while carrying the shadows of old and ancient memories. I'll start with you, Alice. Do you recognize the book I have described, firstly?
I do. I'd like to say too, so this is my first book, and I'm not really experienced at this, but I got Yash's email at my desk the other day, and his thoughtful questions. It was like such a surreal experience to feel like to have a reader that got your work, and totally. That's a feeling that was just better than anything. And I think obviously the bushfires, it ties into the theme of the festival, which is Lapitnyam returning. And I was thinking about it this morning and kind of thinking that slow regeneration is something that maybe, especially in like white Western culture, we kind of want the quick fix, and kind of my book's really much about the 10 years after Black Saturday. So it's, once the media disappears after the first year or the second year or the third year, some people are okay and some people have recovered and other people haven't. And I think, once, the kind of the iconic images of the bushfire reshoots and stuff, it's all very beautiful and important and a big important part of it. But the process is much longer than that. And I think that hopefully my book portrays that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little more as we
Yeah.
go move along. What about you, Roanna? Did you think that was a fair representation? Was that part of the regenerative mood that you think?
Totally. You made the book sound like just so awesome. Yeah, and it is. Thank you. Yeah, it's very generous and really astute reading of the book, and I feel really privileged that someone with your eye and your history of reading and your practice of reading has been able to draw out these really important themes about the urgency of the formation of relationships, the need to do it quickly in a new place so that you can belong. Yeah, that's, I think, wow, thank you.
And as we go along, I think you're going to read one of your a bit of your one of your short stories,
Sure.
which I think sort of pretty much encapsulates some of that. So I think I'm looking forward to that as well. All right, now we sort of move on now, sort of shift gears a bit and talk to Alice separately and to Roanna separately. But it'd be great if you guys would interact as well,
Sure.
which is
I'm happy to do that.
given that. Okay, so I just start with Alice. So
Yeah.
your beautiful essay in Mianjin titled Coppering, which is the first bit I read of Alice's work, seamlessly blends a tortured landscape with your own internal battles to regenerate and to re-emerge. And I was wondering if it's okay for me to ask this question. Can you tell us about your own personal struggles with the Black Saturday fires?
Yeah, so in 2009, I was 22, and obviously most people in the audience will remember Black Saturday, and you remember maybe what you were doing that day, or what you were eating, or what you were watching on the news. But I thought I'd just read. I wrote an essay for Mianjin called "Heroic Men and Helpful Women," and it was kind of about the gendered kind of problems that come out of bushfire. But in the opening section, there's a little bit, it's kind of sums up my connection to the fires. I might read that. Yeah, okay. So I'll just start. So, more home than any landscape I've since known. Christmas Hill's pre-fire forests, both indigenous and introduced, were instantaneously dissolved by the climate-flared firestorms of Saturday, 7th of February, 2009. Our road, Skyline, was raised, a word I only understand now, between 5:45 and 5:59 p.m. It took 14 minutes for everything to burn through. Perhaps the time it takes to enjoy a cup of almost boiled coffee, beans roasted under sepia skies of somewhere else and enjoyed quietly on busy Brunswick streets. Recognised as one of Australia's worst recorded natural disasters, the fires that swallowed up Christmas Hills as Skyline Road make up the historical event that I have learned to remember casually as That Saturday Black, a while back. As a woman, a while back is yet another qualifier to add to my repertoire of many. I'm okay, it's okay, you're okay. In a politically proud white Australia, it's still a woman's place, her unspoken job to make everything okay, especially in the aftermath of natural disaster, when things are very much not. So that's a little bit of that essay, which kind of, shows, I guess, it was a long process to kind of, my parents rebuilt in 2009 on the block, and I also need to acknowledge that, a lot of Wurundjeri people lived through so many fires before us, and I think my essay Coppering, which I read on Friday night, was kind of about that process of recovery, and also I'd linked the two things. So it was that kind of rebuilding process after the bushfire, and then also recovering from an eating disorder, and kind of that link to your body actually rebuilding and growing again. So that was that essay. Yeah.
I also had a question here about, given your
Yeah.
background of writing essays and memoir and so on,
Yeah.
and I think you've sort of touched upon it in the first question when we talked about the short story. Is there anything else you want to add about why you were drawn away
Sorry.
from essays to?
Yeah, so I actually started writing short fiction, and then for some reason I never thought I could write non-fiction, and I don't know if that's kind of, it always just was a bit too hard. And then so Constant Hum started way a long time ago in 2011 as part of a thesis. I had Tony Birch as a supervisor, which he was really amazing. And if anyone hasn't read Tony's work, you should definitely get his work. He's got a book coming out, I think in a month, called The White Girl. And I wrote fiction, and then Jonathan Green from Meanjin actually DM'd me on Twitter, and he was like, "Oh, do you want to write some non-fiction?" And I was like, in my heart, I was like, no, I really don't want to. But you've got to take up these challenges when they come along. And yeah, writing kind of more kind of narrative nonfiction was, it was a great joy as well. So fiction has its place, and nonfiction, and I hope to really write some more nonfiction in the future. So,
Yeah, thanks. Now, I just let you guys know that both these women are really into clothes as well. So I was just going to come to another part of the story collection as well, and I think there's a lot of detail in both writers' books, but in this instance, I'll talk about Alice's, and the theme of color is very strong in your book, and you speak of copper shades of autumn, and one of them, which I think is very evocative, is the pinkness of a bush pigeon's neck, which are over time then changed into gunmetal greys and silvers, which reflect a changing landscape. So it marks the passage of time, but it also marks an event that changes things. And then there's another one where you sort of talk about people's well-worn clothing, and you speak of the faded remnants of a pattern on a well-worn T-shirt. And in many stories, one's also reminded of the partially erased pattern of the landscape, and markers of human presence. So my question is, can you talk to us a bit about your personal interest in the themes of, say, color and well-worn clothing?
Yep. Sorry.
And why is it important to draw
Yeah.
attention to these details?
Well, actually, I hadn't realised, hadn't realised that I had so many references to well-worn clothing in my book until Yash emailed me. And I was thinking about it a lot, and I think why there's so much of that in some of the stories, sorry if there's too much of it, is that I think I was speaking to my dad about it recently too, and there are a couple of items of clothing. So when our house burnt down, my dad got out just in time, and my mum was at the evacuation centre because she's a nurse. And I think you might remember during Black Saturday there was a lot of warnings that got held up by bureaucratic processes, and luckily my family, we all lived, but a lot of people didn't. And my dad kind of, sorry, so many flies. My dad, he found the car keys at the last minute and saw some horrible stuff that but he was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and that t-shirt and those shorts hold kind of a bit of significance now, in that they kind of represent, we kind of so often divide our lives up when big things happen in our lives, and everyone in the audience will have something probably similar where you kind of think the before and after. And I think that kind of the special significance of those items, and not being religious, and especially Western culture's kind of obsession with things, they do hold a pretty special place. And then I think in a few of the stories, a few of the characters, they'll have a faded t-shirt from the t-shirt that they wore when they were running away, and that to them is kind of some remnant of what it was like to not know that everything can go in just a flash. Yeah.
That's beautiful attention to
Yes.
detail,
Yeah.
to allude to a larger story that's happening. It's gorgeous.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, I had a couple more questions
Yeah.
for you, but I've
I
just
feel
sort
like
of,
I'm taking up.
No, no,
No,
no,
no, no, no,
please,
not
I
at
could
all.
sit and
That's
listen to you for the whole
No.
hour.
and I'm glad. If you don't mind, I'm going to move on to Roanna, and then we
Please,
can come
can't
back
wait.
to
Yep.
if when
Yep.
we've got some time left as well. Um, Now, Roanna, did you want to read a bit? And I know I overlooked Alice's reading a bit, but fortunately she did get to read a bit of hers. Would you want to read
Page
a
153.
if you
Oh,
want,
the
or
skit?
did
The
yeah,
skit?
the skip would be nice.
Sure. Okay. This is a story about, again, another story about reading a story. So, and it's about class in immigrant communities as well, and class in outsider communities. So there are these group of Indian students, quite poor in Sydney, who've been invited to the home of this rich couple. They're also Indian, but they're rich. You know, they work. The husband works in one of those PricewaterhouseCoopers type, PwC type consulting roles. And the wife doesn't work; she's at home. But so they, out of the largeness of their hearts, they do the weekend dinners for their fellow Indians who are not as privileged as they are. So one of these Indian students, Rosalind, has written a story. But she's quite hesitant about sharing the story because she's not really a writer. She doesn't see herself as a writer. She is studying a business degree. She's come from India to study to do a business degree in Australia. But her friends are all saying, come on, read it, read out your story. So this was the first time that Lynette is the reader, who's the student who's at the home of Rosalind. So this was the first time she had ever read her writing aloud to anyone, let alone to a whole group of people. She faltered at the start, her tongue tripping on the opening lines of dialogue. But soon she took the silence in the room for interest and was encouraged. The story was an amalgamation of many stories in the newspapers that year. A girl comes to Sydney on a student visa, attends a private college, and studies hairdressing. Like many others before her, she has been promised permanent residency in Australia, or PR, by her migration agent, by her private college, and by the man who stamped her visa. The fees are more than what was advertised in the brochure. When she complains to the student welfare officer, he's very sympathetic, invites her to his house, and after a glass of Riesling, begins to kiss her. She initially resists, like the good woman of Hindi films and convent schools. But he is cute and keen and accurate. She succumbs to the callings of her own body and his. In the throes of passion, however, he says, "Call me Mountbatten." Then, eyes closed, he breathlessly proceeds to call her a stinking curry muncher cunt. She is stunned. She runs away immediately and decides to lodge a complaint of sexual assault and racism through the local courts. He contests the allegations, and playing on the latest cricket match-fixing scandals between India and Australia, he counter-alleges that she was attempting to buy him with sex. The story climaxes with a dramatic courtroom scene and ends with the girl being deported and the student welfare officer getting off scot-free. So that's the story Lynette has just read. Lynette finished reading. There were brand new crystal glasses on the coffee table in front of Lynette. The light from the floor lamp made them glow like compliments. She asked, "So, was it okay?" There was silence. Then Rosalind said, "Oh my, that was, God, you poor thing. Why didn't you tell us you were going through all this?" Lynette had imagined all kinds of feedback. For weeks she had practiced witty comebacks to questions about the dialogue, the sex scene in the story, the decision to reflect India through the broken mirrors of diasporic memory. But the assumption that the skit was autobiographical took her by surprise. No, I didn't go through any of this." Again, a silence full of pity and a collective Catholic ache to be helpful. "Really, nothing like this happened to me, seriously. You mean to say you made it all up?" It's, what's it called, fiction or something? Yes, she said. So it's not true then. Rosalind got up and pulled the curtains back. No. Sushma's eyes were red from the tears she was shedding freely. Such a beautiful story. You are so brave. I mean, the girl is so brave. Poor thing. Lisbeth said, forget your MBA. You should take up writing. See J.K. Rowling? She's rolling in cash. What will your MBA give you? Nothing compared to that. Paul, who had not even taken one sip of his whiskey during the entire reading, now drained his glass and said, Lynette, Lynette, who would have thought the little 2-year-old girl I saw running around in her panties in Barfiwala building in Baikala would one day write plays like Salman Rushdie? Sanjay inhaled sharply, but Paul ignored him and continued, Superb! So proud of you, my girl. Didn't know that students who come here suffer like that. So terrible that she was deported. Sushma said, shit, yaar, what a heart-wrenching ending. Forget Hollywood, forget Bollywood. This is heaps better. You can start an Aussiewood all by yourself. Sanjay reached for the beef roulade and put a piece in his mouth. The only other time he had heard of beef and pork together was in relation to the bullets smeared with the fat of the cow and the pig that sowed the seeds for 1857, the first war of Indian independence. Nice bullets, he said, and then gobbled up a second piece. Beef roulade. High time you Hindu buggers learn the proper names for Catholic food, Rosalind said. Sorry, I was just... Sushma interrupted Sanjay. It was so real what you wrote, so typical of men in power. They always abuse it, especially when there is a succulent and exotic thing in front of them. Sanjay said, Lynette, give me your autograph now only, yaar. When you become famous, you'll forget all of us. Sushma said, this John Greenaway, so there's this other person, a white man with a lot of money who's also expected to join the dinner. This John Greenaway who's coming, read it to him. Maybe he will requisition it, put an encumbrance on it, whatever it is they do with plays, you know what I mean? Lynette said, if John Greenaway likes it, then who knows? I'm ready to quit the MBA and write full time. She looked at Paul and Rosalind. Is it okay if I read it out to him? Isn't it? Paul poured himself another stiff drink. He was drinking scotch because he couldn't find the feni made by his uncle in Saligaon, Goa. The minute he opened the bottle, the aroma spread across the room. It was that good, the feni. He took a sip of his scotch and said, of course, read it, read it. He'll be very impressed. A female Salman Rushdie in Sydney, he'll be impressed. And my neighbor, after all, tell him you got it all from me. Sanjay inhaled sharply again, but Rosalind said, you know me, I don't beat around the bushes. The play is great. You're a great writer. But when you talk about the student welfare officer, he's Australian. Yes, said Lynette. A proper Australian? Yes, said Lynette. White? Asked Rosalind. Proper Australians are blacker than us, said Sushma. White, white, said Lynette. Like John Greenaway. We don't want to offend John Greenaway. He's also Australian. He's also in a position of power. He should be here any time now. What if he thinks you had him in mind? I didn't, Paul added. Poor fellow, just got divorced. Wife left him, Rosalind interrupted. Don't want to offend him. That's true, Lisbeth said. Don't want John Greenaway to get the wrong impression about you. Lynette looked at him, pushed her hair behind her ears. Yes, better leave him alone, Paul said. Recently divorced. Wife left him, Rosalind interrupted again. Lynette began to look through her manuscript. What if I make the student services officer half white and half Aboriginal? I'll stop it there, but it gets worse. It gets worse. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Roanna. You just took me back to Bandra and Bombay for a minute now. That was it's quite special hearing you read it as well. Now, I'll just come to one of your stories, which is The Teller of the Tale, which you also read last evening, and I found that a very powerful story. I just wanted you to read, for me, Australia has become the site of the regenerative, and I just thought if you're happy to read page 153.
Sure, just very short. Sure. So this is the end of a complex story with many different threads, but this is just the end of it. It's about a mother-daughter relationship that has gone a resentful kind of relationship of debts owed and gratitude, etc. But this is the end. The wind carries the smell of the amniotic river to the space between my mother and me. Her arms are so close to me now, so, so close. They are as wide as the river that held her grandmothers, that held a daughter who was yet to be. All is liquid air and rich composted soil. From this, newness will be fashioned. I am sure of it. I do not step back.
Thanks. So for me, the main character in this particular story seems to be sort of rediscovering and acknowledging her mother's traditional ideas of womanhood. And this is my reading of it, of course, and she sees her mother in a new light towards the end of that story, and away from the untainted by the Indian cultural context within which she was sort of framing her mother quite often. It holds the possibility of an emergence of a hybrid womanhood. And for me, that's been a very interesting. We talked about the third space at one of the sessions yesterday about people being nourished by the two soils that they live in, or sort of drawing on those two things. So I was just wondering, do you think this is an immigrant condition, a conundrum that faces many of us when we move to Australia or anywhere else in the world, and something that we have to constantly negotiate and reconcile between what we know and what we have been? And our aspirations are how we are expected to be in this new environment. Is that something that you...
I think that's such a brilliant question and so articulate. I don't know if I can do justice to the question, but in response, yes, I think that we're as outsiders, we are always being nourished by wanting to be nourished by the new soil, wanting to feel like we belong, trying to find ways in which to belong, while also being completely constrained in many ways by the history the histories we come from. So I think it's a constant negotiation, this sense of belonging, to create a sense of belonging. And on Tuesdays you feel like you belong sometimes, and on Thursdays you might feel like you don't belong. It's all dependent on so many different it's a thing that's fluid and alive, the sense of belonging. It's never fixed, and it's a constant process that you have to work towards. Because in my book, some of the characters find solidarity because of race and common cultural histories, but in many cases they find solidarity because of class. Like in one of the stories, there's this woman who works at a petrol station, and that point of connection and the epiphany she has is with this white female cab driver who comes into the shop and buys petrol and is paying for her fuel, etc. And they have this moment of laughter, which is then liberating for the woman in the story. So I just feel that there are many different ways in which we connect and we feel like we belong. And often it is the shared histories with other, in these stories, with other Indian characters, but often it is the shared class positions that some of these characters have with people from different ethnic and race backgrounds.
No, absolutely. Now I had to ask you this question. A.K. Ramanujan, who's a modernist poet and translator of Tamil and Kannada classics. You've referenced him a couple of times at least in that book. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about A.K. Ramanujan, and why does Ramanujan influence your writing?
Yes.
If he does.
Yeah, thank you. I very deliberately wanted to refer to, pay homage to brilliant writers who are outside of the Western literary canon. Because yes, I was schooled in English literature. I have a Bachelor of Arts in English literature and a Master's of Arts. So I'm schooled in the English literary canon, and I love, all the great English writers that we had to read at school and university. But there are also, there's so much literary brilliance, not just stories. We all have stories of trauma and joy and sorrow. Every human being experiences them. But to render that in a way that's fresh and engaging on the page, that's literary virtuosity. And yes, the English writers have that, the great English writers have that, but so too do other writers from other backgrounds. And so I'm constantly trying, in my teaching and in my writing particularly, to pay homage to those amazing writers, A.K. Ramanujan being one of them. And the urgency and the importance of doing that was made so clear to me when I sent that same story, The Teller in the Tale, to someone to proofread it. I was looking for proofreaders, proofreaders, someone to correct the commas and the put the apostrophes in the right places on the it's, etc. But so I sent it to this proofreader recommended by a friend, this white man from New Zealand. I don't know him at all. And he came back, first of all, saying it's the teller. Sorry, what's the title of the story? The teller.
Teller
the,
of the tale.
the teller in the tale is the title. But the proofreader said it's the teller of the tale, not the teller in the tale. So it felt very free to assume that I couldn't put a sentence, to grammatically correct sentence together, rather than assuming that, oh, maybe I'm having fun with the English language. And actually, it's not me, it's Ramanujan's The Teller in the Tale, the story that he wrote about this woman who is burdened by the story she holds and the baggage she's carrying, the emotional baggage she's carrying. And when she tells a story to the walls of a hut, the walls come crumbling down, like symbolic, of making yourself vulnerable and being liberated by that process of putting yourself in that really vulnerable position. So I was referencing that, and Eunice D'Souza, who's an English who's a poet who writes in the English language. She passed away a couple of years ago, but one of the finest poets in India. And she was one of my teachers. Nam Lee, the teller in the tale is a response to his work as well in some ways. And so that's what I've been trying to do. And Ramanujan was just a genius, and I wish his work was known even more. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I think feel free to have more of a discussion with the two writers later. But I just thought we might open it up now a bit for others to ask questions. I might just say that if you could be specific who you're asking the question to, as well as if you could sort of keep it to a question rather than a comment, that would be useful as well. And if you put your hand up, the microphone will come to you and you can ask your questions.
Do we have time for you to read? Do we have time for Alice to read?
I'm sorry,
No. Sorry. This is great. This is perfect.
I specifically direct my question to Roanna and Alice.
That's very specific.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we were asked to do that. I'm a short story fan, and I love the form of the short story. And Roanna, you said that, you fleetingly said that short stories capture fleeting moments, and Alice, you said that they capture that heightened feeling. So that gives me a clue about what you both think about the form. It seems to me that there are one way of looking at forms is there's two traditions. One tradition, which Lynette, your narrator, is a member of, along with Saki and O. Henry and Chekhov, is to have things happen and then there's an end, there's a climax, and there's a resolution. And the other approach, writers like Carver and Alice Munro, is that their stories don't end, they kind of just stop. I'd like you to both reflect on what you think about the relative strengths and weaknesses of those two different ways of forming a short story. The story that stops or the story that ends?
So for me, I remember, thank you for last night. I saw you play last night.
Yeah.
Amazing. I think for me, reading Carver in year 11 literature, I was like, wow, you can just kind of capture those fleeting moments in a way. Life's like that. There's not always like a neat end to things. I mean, sometimes things work out, and most often than not, there's more. I think story writers like Carver and Richard Ford and Tony Birch from Melbourne, and it's really nice to kind of read something and still feel, I guess, that there's some kind of closure even in the moments that don't have any kind of resolution, and there's some kind of comfort to be like appreciation of those small it sounds cliche, but appreciation of the small details in life, which Roanna does so beautifully in her book.
And you do too.
Thank you. But for me, also, flash fiction is such a terrible term. It's very, I don't know, diminutive. It doesn't really do justice to very, very short stories. But for me, I really love really, really short stories, like Josephine Rowe, who I keep mentioning, who write these really tiny, unresolved things, but they are somehow all-encompassing. And there's beauty and comfort and so much in those small, unresolved segments of kind of everyday life.
Yeah, completely agree with whatever Alice said. And I think just whatever Alice said.
No.
So the closed-ended stories are the ones that hit the reader on the head and tell the reader, you're an idiot, you need to be told how this ends. And that's Disney. You can go watch Avengers Endgame if you're into that. And sometimes we need that. After a long day at work, sometimes we need that. But I think the more challenging thing for the writer, and certainly the more interesting thing for readers, as a reader, I'm speaking as a reader, is the open-ended story. It's a story that allows a reader in and says, you make meaning with me, with the writer, the text, the reader, and the writer. You know, that's what I think the best short stories do. They invite the reader in to make their own meaning. And yeah, I'm a fan of the open-ended short story. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, good
Thanks.
question.
Any other questions? If not, I overlooked Alice's reading of a story. If with everyone else's permission, can we get her to read?
Yes, please.
Sorry about that.
I don't know which one to read. I was going to read. Maybe I'll
You're
read a
going to
really
read
short
bit
one.
of or even Highway Lines. Wasn't that what you
That's a
originally?
bit kind of
Long, is it?
sad to end on.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me think. I could read like a really, really short one. And then, okay. So this one's called Horses. It's really short and it's like really, really short. But it kind of came out of, after Black Saturday, I remember I read this piece, I think it was like ABC or something, and it was about women in Kinglake which was for people who aren't from Melbourne, it was one of the worst, had the highest death tolls. And there was this really small story, and it was about women who had, not a lot of people got warnings, but they'd let their horses free before the bushfires had come, and they'd known. And the way of identifying the horses was that they'd written their mobile numbers in their hides in chalk, and then kind of slapped them and got them to run away, in the kind of hope that was the best hope they had of surviving. So this is Horses, and again I stress it's very, very, very short. But that image really stuck with me, and that kind of hopelessness, hope that you have when you realise that you're human and the natural world is so much bigger than you, and maybe you've taken that for granted as well. And so this is called Horses. There were still reports, years later, of the horses that night. Their coats matted and sweet from sweat in smoke-blurred headlights. That sounds so short, but yeah, it's very short. Yeah.
Beautiful.
It's poetic. That's beautiful.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and thanks to both of you. Please join me in thanking both Roanna and Alice.
Thank you, Yash.
And thank you, Yash. Yeah. Thank you.